Hunger, the oldest pandemic in the world. Azra Assan in conversation with World Food Programme Country Director Brenda Barton.
Poor communities around the world are sending a clear, an urgent and a repeated message about hunger. What is the situation now? You may remember that the United Nations World Food Programme received a Nobel Peace Prize award for the achievements and for their efforts in combating hunger. We are here to speak to Ms. Brenda Barton, the Country Director for Sri Lanka of the World Food Programme. Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be
here. Tell us
here.
About the award that you received.
Well, WFP was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which was an enormous recognition for the work that we do globally. The staff of the World Food Programme were absolutely surprised, we were shocked, we were humbled, but we felt that it was indeed recognition of the work that we do to feed some 90 million people every day in some of the worst spots in the world.
I mean, this is the first time in my life I've been speechless. I mean, this is unbelievable. Talk about the most exciting point in time in your life is the Nobel Peace Prize, and it's because of the WFP family. They're out there in the most difficult, complex places in the world, whether it's war, conflict, climate extremes, it doesn't matter. They're out there and they deserve this award. And wow, 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 wow. I can't believe it.
The Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize to the World Food Programme for its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict.
So, one might wonder, who is WFP of the United Nations? Just explain to us what you do.
Thank you. I know that the UN is a vast organization, and to many it's a bunch of different letters. So we are the WFP, the World Food Programme, but we're the agency that is tasked to fight hunger worldwide and to help to save lives, but also to change lives. So we're the ones that are on the front lines, for example, in Yemen, in Syria, now in Ethiopia, feeding people, making sure that no matter where they are, that they get a meal, whether it comes out of the back of an airplane or is delivered by a camel. But we're also the people that are feeding children in schools, that are helping malnourished mothers have special products that can nourish their bodies and their babies.
As the international community has committed to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition by 2030, 1 in 9 people worldwide still do not have enough to eat. Food and food-related assistance lie at the heart of the struggle to break the cycle of hunger and poverty. For its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict, World Food Programme was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year. In 2019, World Food Programme assisted 97 million people, the largest number since 2012, in 88 countries. On any given day, World Food Programme has 5,600 trucks, 30 ships and nearly 100 planes on the move, delivering food and other assistance to those in most need. In emergencies, World Food Programme is often first on the scene, providing food assistance to the victims of war, civil conflict, drought, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, crop failures and natural disasters. When the emergency subsides, World Food Programme helps communities rebuild shattered lives and livelihoods. In 2019, World Food Programme provided 4.2 million metric tons of food and $2.1 billion of cash and vouchers. Funded entirely by voluntary donations, World Food Programme raised a record-breaking $8 billion in 2019. World Food Programme has 20,000 staff worldwide, of whom over 90% are based in the countries where the agency provides assistance.
Brenda, we heard the executive director of the World Food Programme describing food as vaccine. What does this mean?
It is an unusual way of expressing the tool that food really is to families and to communities. We've seen what happens when we have droughts, when we have floods. We've seen what happens when we have war. That food is such a fundamental need for families. It really is the thread between life and death. And now with COVID, it is really a vaccine. It's what people need to survive. We saw in Sri Lanka how families were under lockdown, and the first thing that they became desperate about, of course, was their access to food. So ensuring that people are relaxed, that they know they can get what they need to sustain their families, it really is a vaccine. And it's also a way of protecting the body and having that needed food for the immunity that we need to fight the pandemic.
Where does Sri Lanka stand in this case, and how critical is it in Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka, we've seen, of course, a real curve situation where we have had the pandemic hit, where we've had to have lockdowns, where we've had openings, and then when recently, of course, we've had to constrain the movements of people. And throughout that period, of course, people's access to food has been critical. So there have been a number of moves we've all seen, which have entailed for food trucks to arrive, for people to get access to supermarkets. But it is something that has to be very carefully monitored in terms of also the food production. We've seen problems, for example, of people being able to transport the food that has been produced in the field to markets. So it's a very fluid situation, but overall, we've really seen how food is an essential item during something like the pandemic, alongside all the other kinds of responses.
I think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected not just Sri Lanka, but many countries across the world. Could you briefly explain to us about the work that the World Food Programme does in Sri Lanka?
The work that we're doing in Sri Lanka is fourfold. So one of the major things that we're gripped with right now is the upcoming monsoon season. And that is going to mean that many families, for example, in the north and the east, who are also facing the pandemic, are going to have to potentially leave their homes, and they're going to have to seek refuge. And we're working very closely with the communities and with the government to ensure that people have safe access to facilities and that they can be fed when they're there. So a lot of the early warning and prevention side is where the World Food Programme comes in. On the other side, we're working a lot with farming communities, and we're helping farming communities have greater access to sustainable livelihoods, meaning that they get hit by a drought, they get hit by a flood. If they're only farming, that's all they can do. Whereas if they have alternate livelihoods, alternate employment, then they have an opportunity to cope better with the climate shocks that we know are in the country. And in between that, WP helps with school meals, and we're also helping the government with nutrition programs.
So in simpler terms, WFP is working closely with the ground level communities of Sri Lanka.
WP is working with the communities at the ground level, but we're also working with the business sector to try to ensure that the business sector is providing healthy and nutritious alternatives to people. And of course, we're supporting the government and other UN agencies in reaching what is well known as the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and in our case, zero hunger.
What has the WFP done following the end of the civil conflict in Sri Lanka?
WFP was very well known during the civil conflict for ensuring that food trucks and ships were arriving in order to feed people on both sides of the conflict. And we're also quite well known for the response that we had during the tsunami. Since then, the government and moving toward a middle income context, WFP's responses have had to change. And what we are now being asked to do is to help the government use better, let's say, systems that are globally accepted to predict what's going to happen on climate change, or to look at the best school meals programs that can be implemented. These kinds of, let's say, hand up versus hand out types of activities.
Malnutrition among children in Sri Lanka is a pressing issue. What could be done to address this?
The problem with malnutrition amongst children is that it really is a hidden hunger problem. It's not evident in Sri Lanka like it is in many other countries. Here what happens is that children are just slightly, but they are too thin for their height. And on the other hand, many children don't have the right amount of vitamins and nutrients in their bodies. So the kinds of things that need to be done to address this are expanding what programs already exist in the country, Triposha and nutrition programs through the Mother and Child Health Centers, but also education to families, understanding what are the right foods, what should be eaten, and as well providing alternatives to snack foods, which we know of course is something that's done in every country, but having more healthy alternatives to snack foods.
But there's also another side to the story. Some people are overnutrition. What does that mean? Is there a difference, or is it because they have too much food?
It's a simplistic term, but what it really means is that people are eating too much. So we have a high level of obesity and a high level of overweight amongst women of reproductive age. So that means basically women up into the age of about 45 in this country. And I'll use 45 again because 45% of women of reproductive age are actually overweight or obese. And I know that's a shocking figure. It's something that people don't realize, but it is an upward trend, and it's actually continuing to increase over time. It's actually a problem that we see in many growing economies, many middle-income economies, whereby women are working, they're eating quickly, they're not having time to eat, to prepare the food for the families, and again, back to the alternatives, they may not be choosing healthy alternatives, and they may be relying, for example, on starchy foods like rice, which we all love.
Sri Lankans are very used to rice. That's starch right there.
Yes.
Right? So how can we educate people about what is good and what is bad?
So we've done some really deep research on this issue because it is, as you say, so prevalent, and rice is such a staple and a precious commodity and a beloved commodity that everybody is eating. What we feel is that there should just be a shift in people recognizing that when you eat this amount of rice, the amount of sugar you're consuming at the same time is very, very high. So it's more a proportion control. So reducing the amount of rice, introducing more vegetables and more other foods that are just balancing that plate, that can go a long way.
Brenda, when we speak about hunger and food in the country, water also plays an important role. What we personally, Newsfirst, found out was during our Gammad initiative, where we went from door to door to inquire into the issues faced by the people. We saw that many people in rural Sri Lanka, they do not have access to clean drinking water, or they do not have water to engage in their day-to-day activities. What is your take on this, and what is the contribution of the WFP?
Water is fundamental because we've seen in Sri Lanka, when I came in 2016, we had one of the worst droughts in 40 years. And then on the other hand, you get these floods, and people are running and seeking refuge. So it's really the management of water that is critical. And we've been doing a lot of work as WFP to rehabilitate the small and the minor irrigation dams and the canals to make sure that water is able to flow to farmers' fields, and at the same time teaching people how to harvest their own water. So when rainwater comes, or building the types of wells that can conserve the water. I think Sri Lanka is a country that's not had to worry about water in previous years, but now it is a precious commodity, and I know many, many actors are working in that regard to try to address that.
You touched upon the climate change in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is ranked 6th on the list of the countries most likely to be affected by climate shocks. Could you explain to us about it?
Yes, it really is a factor that we are seeing in climate change. Wet zones getting wetter, dry zones getting drier, and Sri Lanka does typically get hit by cyclones. We're getting ready right now for what's going to be ahead in the northeast monsoon, and it is predicted that the rains are going to be higher than normal this season. We've been actually quite lucky the last two, so it is not something that's going to go away. It is a factor, and it's a factor also of the Asia region. Therefore, the question is not if, it's a matter of when, and how to manage those crises, how to prepare more in advance, and to reduce the devastation and the destruction that inevitably will come.
The COVID-19 pandemic has adversely affected those living in Sri Lanka and across the globe. And people are now finding it difficult to engage in their livelihoods, earn and go on with their day-to-day lives. When it comes to Sri Lanka, how bad do you think we will be affected? We are already affected, but when it comes to malnutrition, how do you think we will be affected?
This is something that keeps me up at night because we know that the impact of food insecurity, basically people's ability or inability to buy enough food, is going to be only seen as time goes on. We're only going to see the true effect of poor nutrition on children, and especially mothers who may be pregnant right now, as time goes on. It's something that inevitably in all of the countries that are affected by COVID, and Sri Lanka will not be different than that. There will be a net effect. So the question is, to what extent? And this is where, again, making sure that people are accessing nutritious foods. We've seen a trend of people reducing meat, reducing fish, reducing poultry, really critical protein sources. This is a very worrisome trend, but it is a factor of people not having enough income and making a compromise.
Brenda, now the main reason behind most of these issues is the financial restrictions that these people have. How can the World Food Program encourage people or help them to find a way of survival than relying on direct aid?
Right. I mean, the World Food Program is just one of many, many entities responding to this crisis, and it really is a collective. There's not any one thing that we can do, but what we can do is work together with other partners. So the very important thing is to ensure that there are what we call food systems in place. So it's not just looking at our own individual piece, which we do, which is trying to help farmers grow more food and have access to markets and children have meals in the classroom, but it's really looking at the whole system from the farmer right to the table. And that includes food waste, food safety, transport systems, market functionality. It's whole food system, and that's something that we're working on together with many other partners, including the government.
How has the World Food Program contributed in mitigating the COVID-19 pandemic, not just here in Sri Lanka, let's say world over?
One of the key programs that we found that is truly effective is our school meals. We know that a meal that a child receives in school offsets the income of the family and offsets that economic pressure that, for example, in Sri Lanka, the loss of day labor. So what we did here with the government is that we helped to launch a take-home ration. So while children were not getting a meal in school, they were able to pick up the meal in an outside location, and that helped at least the family for a couple of months to bear the cost of the meals that they were not receiving at school. So this is one area that we've worked on.
So what are WFP's plans for the next few years?
WFP is here to respond to the needs of the country. So when I arrived here 4 years ago, the situation was very much in a very positive trend in the sense that, yes, we have climate shocks, we have these nutrition issues, but it was really to try to bring whatever technical expertise that we have globally to the government and to other stakeholders to use. But of course, we know that the world is not a static place. So now here we have COVID.
Yes.
So we need to be very nimble and flexible.
It's a different challenge every day.
To respond. And so this may be shifting a bit the way that we do things, focusing more on the social safety nets in the country, social programs, for example, and working in new and different ways with different partners. The private sector is absolutely critical because the private sector at the end of the day ensures that people have access to food and have access to healthy alternatives. So we're doing a lot of work, for example, with the private sector in that regard as well.
Brenda, we always speak about hunger and how, like you mentioned earlier, how hunger can lead to conflicts in a country. This is not something that we don't know, but there are not much that is being done effectively enough to tackle this issue. What is your advice to the government of Sri Lanka from the World Food Program when it comes to combating hunger and maintaining peace in the country?
What I've seen from my many, many years working in Africa was that a hungry man is an angry man. And we know that if people feel desperate, and they feel desperate usually immediately when they feel that their basic needs, such as food, is not being met, it can very quickly turn into a situation of concern, and therefore WFP advocates globally to make sure that people are being able to get food. We're seeing right now in Ethiopia, a conflict has suddenly burst there, and people are streaming over the borders into Sudan and neighboring countries. WFP has to do whatever it can to get food to those people. So we feel that food is a piece, a strong part of the piece. If people have food, they have access to it. It's not the overall solution, of course, but it can help to quell tensions and emotions.
What is your message to our viewers who are watching us right now on how they can contribute to help WFP achieve zero hunger and maintain peace? How can they contribute?
I think everybody can play their own role in terms of helping ensure that their families just at home are making healthy choices and not resorting to having to take out the healthy part or nutritious part of the meals just in order to fill the bellies. I know that's easier said than done, but there is a lot of information that's out there about alternatives, for example, cowpeas and things that can provide very important nutritious sources. So I think it starts at home, and then it starts with the programs that the government is offering, making sure that children that are going to clinics can get with their mothers the assistance that they need, or they get the school meals that once the schools open. These kinds of programs are absolutely essential in helping to address the hunger right now and the issues that are rising from COVID.
Most people in Sri Lanka are restricted to their homes because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in Sri Lanka. What steps do you suggest, simple ones, that they can do in their home to help to achieve zero hunger and maintain peace?
I would say that people should pay attention to the foods that they are eating and the choices that they're making, and to the degree possible introducing healthy foods like vegetables and fruits, and even though we know they may be a little bit more costly, not compromising on those because they need that for their immunity. We would also say that families can do home gardening. This is something that has been rolled out quite extensively, and WFP's been supporting home gardens as well as the provision of water and other things, because it's a way that families can diversify the foods that they have to eat, and they have them ready made in their own area. And another area I would say is not to fall into listening to fake news and to false information and food myths. We've seen, for example, recently that many people stopped eating fish, which is a hugely important protein source to the diet, because they were afraid that it was carrying COVID. So to really look for factual information and make fact-based decisions is in my mind, super important.
Thank you, Brenda, for joining us and having this timely discussion about what we all want to hear, because COVID-19 is a season that we all have to be extra cautious about what we eat and on what we do. So thank you, Ms. Brenda Barton, the WFP Country Director for Sri Lanka, for joining us today to enlighten our viewers about what can be done, and most importantly, what is the situation of the country right now. That's it from me for tonight. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Azra Assan.
Hunger, the oldest pandemic in the world. Azra Assan in conversation with World Food Programme Country Director Brenda Barton.